There are some stories that feel too disturbing, too surreal to ever be real. Stories that make you stop and ask yourself, how could someone go so far? How could someone betray the very people who gave them life? Tonight, you are about to step into one of those stories, a chilling journey into lies, deception, and ultimately murder. This is not a tale about strangers crossing paths in the dark. No, this is about a son and the parents who loved him. A family that seemed ordinary, comfortable, safe, until the truth cracked open and revealed something no one could have imagined. It begins in the quiet suburbs of Wisconsin, the kind of place where the American dream feels alive and simple. A modest home, tree-lined streets, neighbors who wave, a family of 4 living an unremarkable but steady life. Bart and Krista Halderson had built that life. Bart was the kind of man who believed in responsibility, who had worked hard as an accountant to provide for his family. Krista was warm, compassionate, the glue that held everything together. They were proud of their 2 sons, Mitch, the older one, who had joined the Navy, and Chandler, their youngest, just 23 years old, still finding his way. From the outside, it all seemed picture perfect. But inside that picture, behind closed doors, Chandler was hiding something. At first, it was small, a lie about a class, an excuse for a bad grade. Then another, and another, until it grew into an entire double life. Chandler told his parents, his girlfriend, his friends, that he was enrolled at a respected college, studying for a bright future. He claimed he was on the verge of starting an impressive career in technology. He even went as far as saying he was about to work for SpaceX, one of the most coveted companies in the world. It all sounded incredible, and everyone around him believed it. But none of it was true. Not a single piece. Chandler wasn't in school. He didn't have a job. He wasn't connected to SpaceX or any other company for that matter. He was lying every day to everyone, and the web of lies kept stretching tighter and tighter. But here's the thing about lies. They can only last so long before reality starts clawing its way back in. For Chandler, that moment of truth came in the summer of 2021. Bart, his father, grew suspicious. After years of hearing stories about classes and jobs and opportunities that never seemed to materialize, Bart wanted proof. He asked Chandler to hand over official documents from the college, real records, and Chandler, cornered, had nothing. His excuses weren't working anymore. He knew the truth was about to come out. And that's where this story takes its first chilling turn. Because instead of coming clean, instead of admitting failure, Chandler chose something unthinkable. He decided his parents, the very people who had supported him, trusted him, loved him, were now obstacles standing in his way. And obstacles, in Chandler's mind, had to be removed. On July 1st, 2021, as the summer sun warmed Wisconsin, Bart and Krista had no idea that their lives were about to end at the hands of their own son. In their home, where laughter had once filled the air, where family dinners were shared, a different sound erupted. A sound of violence. A moment that forever shattered the illusion of safety. What followed was not only murder, but something darker, something so disturbing it shocked even seasoned investigators. Chandler didn't just kill his parents. He dismembered them. He tried to erase them. Piece by piece, he attempted to scatter their remains across the countryside, as if doing so could also scatter the truth. But truth has a way of resurfacing, no matter how deeply you try to bury it. And Chandler's lies, his actions, and his arrogance would soon unravel in front of the world. This is the story of Chandler Halderson, a son who lied, a son who killed, in a case that forces us all to look at the terrifying reality that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from strangers. It comes from within our own families. The 4th of July weekend in America is a time of celebration. Families gather, fireworks light up the sky, the air smells of barbecues and freedom. For Bart and Krista Halderson, that weekend was supposed to be no different. They had plans, simple ones, to spend time together and enjoy the holiday. But in their own home, just days before the festivities, the illusion of normalcy came crashing down. On July 1st, Bart confronted Chandler once again about his supposed college enrollment. He wanted to see actual proof, emails, transcripts, anything official. Chandler had been telling his parents for years that he was on track to graduate. He told them he had landed a high-paying job at an insurance company and that a future with SpaceX awaited him. But by then, the lies had become too tangled. He couldn't back them up with real evidence. Bart's demand was simple, and Chandler's fear was overwhelming. In that moment, something snapped. Chandler decided that if he couldn't maintain the lie, he'd remove the ones demanding the truth. What happened inside that house remains partially hidden, because only Chandler knows the exact sequence. But evidence shows that sometime that day, Chandler shot his father, Bart, in the back. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't self-defense. It was cold, calculated, and deliberate. When Krista came home later, Chandler turned on her too. 2 lives gone, just like that. A mother and father, stripped of their future, stripped of the chance to ever see their sons grow older. But the horror didn't stop there. Killing his parents was only the beginning. Chandler now faced another problem: how to hide what he had done. And what came next chilled even hardened detectives to their core. Instead of calling for help, instead of panicking and confessing, Chandler methodically began the process of dismembering his parents. With cold precision, he used tools from around the house to cut their bodies apart. Think about that for a moment. These weren't strangers. These were the 2 people who had raised him, sacrificed for him, loved him unconditionally. And he turned their bodies into something unrecognizable. Piece by piece, Chandler packed parts of his parents into containers. He began driving around rural Wisconsin, scattering remains like trash along riverbanks, in ditches, on farmland. He even brought some to a property owned by his girlfriend's family, hiding body parts near a river where he thought no one would ever look. Imagine the mindset it takes to do something like that. To not only kill, but to desecrate. To take human lives and treat them as obstacles, as garbage to be disposed of. That was Chandler's reality. And as he dumped the remains, he kept lying, kept smiling, kept pretending everything was normal. But lies only work until cracks begin to show. And the cracks were about to split wide open. On July 7th, Chandler himself reported his parents missing. Yes, the same man who had killed them walked into law enforcement and claimed he didn't know where his parents were. He told police that Bart and Krista had gone to their cabin up north for the holiday weekend and never came back. He even spun a story about how they had left with another couple, people Chandler couldn't quite identify, and how they just hadn't returned. At first glance, police might have seen Chandler as a concerned son. But detectives are trained to notice the little things, the hesitations, the details that don't quite fit. And Chandler's story was full of holes. When police checked the supposed cabin trip, nothing matched. There was no record of Bart and Krista leaving. No one had seen them. Their vehicles were still at home. And yet Chandler was oddly calm, oddly rehearsed. His story didn't carry the panic of a real missing persons case. As detectives pressed further, Chandler's lies unraveled faster. They discovered he had no job, no school enrollment, no future with SpaceX. It was all a fantasy. And behind that fantasy lay the chilling reality of what he had done. Within days, investigators began to recover human remains. First small, haunting discoveries in rural areas. Then larger, finds that confirmed the unthinkable. They belonged to Bart and Krista Halderson. The parents who had loved Chandler, now reduced to evidence bags, discovered because their own son had tried and failed to erase them from existence. When detectives began piecing together the Haldersons' disappearance, one thing became clear very quickly. Chandler wasn't acting like a grieving son. He wasn't calling friends in panic, he wasn't begging for help, and he wasn't consumed by fear that something terrible had happened to his parents. Instead, he was calm, too calm. And when he did speak, his stories kept changing. At first, Chandler told police his parents had gone to the family's cabin for the 4th of July weekend. He said they left with another couple, but when pressed, he couldn't provide names or details. Investigators found that odd. Most people can at least say who their loved ones were with. Then Chandler claimed he had texted his parents while they were gone, but detectives soon discovered the texts were staged, messages he sent after they were already dead, hoping to create the illusion they were still alive. The more detectives looked, the more inconsistencies appeared. Chandler said his parents drove away in their car, but both vehicles remained at the Halderson home. He said he didn't know much about their plans, yet he seemed strangely rehearsed when answering even simple questions. Detectives had seen this before. It wasn't the behavior of someone in shock. It was the behavior of someone performing. Behind the scenes, police began a quiet surveillance operation. They followed Chandler, tracked his phone, and pulled digital records. One piece of evidence stood out almost immediately: location data from Chandler's Snapchat account. On the very days his parents went missing, his phone had pinged near rural areas, farmland, and wooded spots far from home. Those pings lined up perfectly with where investigators would later uncover human remains. When search teams scoured the countryside, they found haunting evidence. On one property, hidden near a river, was Bart Halderson's torso. Elsewhere, fragments of bone and tissue were discovered. The remains were burned, cut apart, scattered like trash. It was brutal, it was personal, and it was unmistakably connected to Chandler. Meanwhile, detectives dug deeper into Chandler's life. They quickly uncovered the mountain of lies he had told. The college degree he bragged about? Non-existent. The job at an insurance company? Fiction. The upcoming position at SpaceX? A complete fantasy. Investigators even learned that Chandler had told his girlfriend he suffered a head injury so severe it left him unable to drive. He used this excuse to get rides from her family, rides that he used to transport his parents' remains. Piece by piece, the illusion crumbled. Chandler wasn't a hard-working college graduate on the verge of a dream career. He was an unemployed 23-year-old who had spent years weaving lies so elaborate that even his closest family believed them. And when the truth threatened to surface, he chose murder over exposure. Detectives now had enough evidence to act. On July 8th, just a week after Bart and Krista were killed, Chandler Halderson was arrested. At first, it was under suspicion of providing false information about his parents' disappearance. But as remains continued to be identified and forensic evidence tied him directly to the crimes, the charges grew darker. He was accused of murdering both of his parents, mutilating their bodies, and attempting to conceal the evidence. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors who had seen Chandler mowing the lawn, walking outside, and chatting casually just days earlier couldn't believe what they were hearing. To them, he was quiet, polite, almost shy. The idea that this young man had not only killed his parents but also dismembered them was beyond comprehension. But detectives knew the truth. They had followed the trail of lies, and now they had the man responsible. Still, there was one more battle ahead: the courtroom. And when Chandler finally faced justice, the world would see the disturbing depth of his deception. By the time Chandler Halderson walked into a courtroom, the world already knew him as the smiling young man who had killed his own parents. But trials are about evidence, not headlines, and the prosecution had plenty of it. The case they laid out was chilling in its detail. They showed the jury digital trails from Chandler's phone, data proving he had been at the sites where his parents' remains were found. They played surveillance footage that placed him in areas where no innocent explanation existed. They presented text messages Chandler had sent after the murders, pretending his parents were still alive, as if a few words on a screen could erase what he had done. And then there was the forensic evidence. Investigators had recovered blood in the Halderson home. They had found tools, saws, cutting instruments used to dismember Bart and Krista. They had gathered DNA evidence tying it all directly back to Chandler. Every piece fit. Every detail painted the same picture. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was planned, calculated, and merciless. But beyond the science and technology, prosecutors leaned on something more human: the lies. They walked the jury through years of Chandler's false stories. The fake college classes, the made-up jobs, the absurd claim of working for SpaceX. They showed how Chandler lived in a world of his own creation, built on deception, and how, When that world was on the verge of collapsing, he resorted to the ultimate betrayal. The defense, meanwhile, had little to stand on. They hinted at possible brain injuries. They suggested Chandler wasn't fully aware of what he was doing. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury could see through it. They weren't looking at a confused young man. They were looking at someone who had lied with ease, who had killed without hesitation, and who had tried to cover it all up with a disturbing kind of calm. Day after day, witnesses took the stand. Friends, neighbors, investigators, forensic experts. Each one added another layer to the story, another nail in the coffin of Chandler's defense. And as the trial played out, the courtroom and the country saw the true face of Chandler Halderson. Not a victim, not a confused son, but a manipulator, a murderer. When the jury finally returned with a verdict, it was swift and unanimous. Guilty on all counts. First-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, hiding a corpse. The list went on. Chandler Halderson, at just 23 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He will never walk free again. For Bart and Krista's family, there was no real sense of victory. Justice may have been served, but nothing could bring back the 2 lives lost. Nothing could erase the image of what had been done to them. Their surviving son, Mitch, who served his country with honor, now carries the unbearable weight of losing both parents to the actions of his own brother. And for the community, for everyone who followed the case, the lesson lingers like a shadow. Sometimes evil doesn't come in the form we expect. Sometimes it wears the face of a quiet young man, a neighbor, even a son. As you think about this story, imagine the weight of it. The ordinary American family in the suburbs, whose trust and love were repaid with betrayal and violence. A father and mother who gave everything to their child, only to be destroyed by him. It's the kind of story that makes you question just how well we ever know the people closest to us. The Chandler Halderson case will be remembered not only for its brutality, but also for the haunting reminder it carries. That deception, when left unchecked, can spiral into something unthinkable. And that beneath the surface of a seemingly normal life, darkness can sometimes hide in plain sight. This is not just the story of a murder. It is the story of lies. Lies that grew so large, so uncontrollable, that they consumed everything around them. Lies that ended in tragedy. And as Chandler sits in prison for the rest of his life, those lies are all he has left. So the next time you hear a story that feels too perfect, too polished, too good to be true, remember this one. Because sometimes behind the smile, behind the dream, there's something far more sinister waiting to be revealed.